what we see is that now 400 years go by, and the English now have been taken over by the Normans. We have the invasion of 1066, and William the Conqueror comes in and wins a battle against the Anglo-Saxon king. The result is that now we have the French come in, of all things. And now we have instead of English common law, we're going back to the king's law out of Rome. So we're having a destruction of the idea of a republic. Now we're going back to a complete tyranny with the top down, where the lords control everything. Well, this begins to dominate England, and as you know, if you've watched your Robin Hood movies, you know that King John was a very wicked king, as was his brother, the Lionheart. But John was especially bad. He starved the peasants in the street. Literally, they were starving. They took so much from them, they even took their pigs, which was their last thing that they had, and the only animals they could sleep with at night. And they were starving the peasants and raping and pillaging the wives and the children even of the barons. And so, and as well as taking the lands of the church. And so there was a rebellion, but they raised an army called the Army of God, and they put the barons as well as the commoners, and they came after John in outside of London at his castle, and he had no choice. He was outnumbered, he was outgunned, but before they went, there was no battles fought in this war. They went to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who was a devout Christian, who wrote a document called Magna Carta, 63 different articles, and begins with "The church in England shall forever be free." It was a Christian document from the beginning to the end, again setting the structure of each man has a right to trial by jury, the idea that there's justice and equality before the law. All the principles, most of the principles that are in our United States Constitution, again, come from Magna Carta. When we fought the American Revolution, Magna Carta was the battle cry. People still understood that Magna Carta was foundational because it was biblically based, and it was written by the greatest spiritual leader of the time, Stephen Langton. So Magna Carta had to be agreed to 38 different times by the kings, who kept breaking it. And so they had to call him back 38 different times. One of those kings that you're familiar with is Longshanks, who is that Edward the Longshanks who killed, ultimately drew and quartered our friend William Wallace in about 1305 AD. And this was the Longshanks who said he believed in Magna Carta, and then he went out and killed all the Christians of Wales and then marched his army north to kill the Scots. So he was a butcher's butcher, and yet God ended up in the long run, even after the death of William Wallace, raising the Scottish love of liberty. Remember the Celtic Christianity that never went away. The Scots have always had a sense of self-government, which I believe came from the Word of God, coming early from Columba and from Patrick, and they said it was wrong. And they wrote a document after they defeated the English in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn. They wrote a document called the Declaration of Arbroath, which was the first national covenant written by a people declaring that all nations should be free, and should be free of tyrants. And if a man rules as a tyrant, the people have a right to rise up and kill the king. And they even said, if our king rises up and tyrannizes the people of Scotland, we will destroy him. And by the way, this was being written to the Pope, and they said, Pope, if you do that to us, we will take care of you too. So typical Scottish exaggeration. But that's what they did. And so this is a very important document, and it set the stage for the Scots 250 years later being the center focus of American liberty. For there would have been no America had there not been a John Knox. And if a John Knox had not brought the gospel of Jesus Christ into the center of Scotland, and those early martyrs in the 17th, 16th, and 17th centuries, if they had not converted much of Scotland and the Kirk, if they had not broken with the Roman Church, if they had not set up a Presbyterian form of government, which then was moved into the covenant of their national structure, if they had not written the national covenant, which was an educational document denying the right of the King of England to tell them how to raise their children, and they all signed it. I was there just 4 weeks ago, and we went in where it is. It has not been on national display until this year. You can go in and see it. There's about 40 different copies because they copied it and sent it all over the country. And every Scotsman who loved Jesus signed it, a lot of them in their own blood. And you can see the signatures of all the Scots on the front of the document, and you can go around the back, and they've got it in glass. You can see it on the back of the document. 40,000 of them signed this document, starting in the Greyfriars churchyard, and there were about that many over the next 38 years that were killed in the killing times. 18,000 ministers and their wives were then systematically killed by the King of England because they had signed the National Covenant. Now you're talking a serious martyrdom that no one even knows about. And even the Scots today make fun of the Covenanters. In their National Museum, they've got one piece of glass with one little scarf from a lady who was given it by her husband. And it said every time a Covenanter would get married, he would give his burial cloth to his wife, saying, "Today you have me alive, and I love you dearly, but soon you will bury me in this cloth." You know, what a nice, kind of an exciting wedding day, you know. But that's the way it was for 35, 40 years in Scotland when the King of England tried to destroy their religious liberty. And what's that? It started with Charles I, and then Charles II, and James II. So a series of 3 of the Stuart kings until 1688, when the last Stuart king was overthrown, the English Bill of Rights was set up, and the beginning of liberty in England. There would never again be a tyrannical king in England, and there would be a parliament, and there would be a control. It would be a limited monarchy from that point on, and the beginning of liberty in America. That was the foundation stone of it beginning in our country, because those Scots then who were persecuted by the English, where do you think they ended up? They all immigrated to America, including my relatives. My father's name was McNeil, my mother was a French Huguenot, and I can begin to trace them back, and I know that they came from the island of Bata in the north coast of Scotland, and they were persecuted out and thrown on slave ships and taken to places like Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. But they knew how to read, they knew the Bible, and they became the instant schoolmasters of America. And they became the ones like John Witherspoon, who then ended up training, 12 or 13 of our major leaders during the Revolution, and many others over a period of many years at Princeton University. What we have is these Scottish men coming over with a knowledge of the Word of God, and as a result, they loved Jesus, and they were able to then take these truths and unfold them. But Scotland played a mighty role in this. This is the history of Scotland you don't hear. No one talks about the Covenanters. We were there with our tour, and there's a shopping center around a place called the Marketplace, and it's called the Marketplace Cross, and there's a monument with a big red X, and no one knows what it is, and then there's a little plaque over to the side, and it says, "Here's where thousands of Covenanters were drawn and quartered and hung during a period of 100 years. This went on and on and on. And this is where, right below the cathedral in Edinburgh, and just below the graveyard called Greyfriars churchyard. And if you go to the Greyfriars, as we did, and I had a Scottish Covenanter relative for the first time who told me details I didn't know this time. He said, "Do you know there were 1,200 of these Covenanters put in this one grave, and that's why there's this big old monument that no one could read until the Covenanter relatives started cleaning it, and it says, this is dedicated to the 18,000 Covenanters who have died and are buried in this graveyard, and to their wives." And then it's a big white sand thing about 18 by 20. And I asked the guy, "What's this big white sand thing in front of the monument?" He said, "That's a common grave where all of the criminals and all of the murderers of Scotland were thrown into this common pit that was 100 feet deep, and they threw the bodies in with no wrapping or anything, just threw the body after they'd cut their head off or whatever they did. And the Covenanters were thrown in the same pit because they were so hated. And the Covenanter women and the Covenanters negotiated with the government so that that's where they got the white linen cloth, and there are all the poems about it. When you had a wedding, the reason you gave the white cloth is so that when you were killed, at least your body was given the dignity. They would know that you were an innocent person who had been thrown into the thieves' pile. So thousands of these Covenanters were thrown with thieves and murderers and the same, but they were wrapped in their white linen cloth. And so when I was standing there, I stood up on the cross and I started preaching to these people in this mall, this outside mall. And so I just preached the story of James Guthrie. And I said, in 1561, James Guthrie, the hero of Scotland, stood on this place and preached to 5,000 of you Scots. Do you know the story? I have a terrible accent. I sound like an Irishman. But anyway, so I didn't speak in, you don't want to speak in an accent when you don't have one. But I gave the story of James Guthrie and how he walked out that day and put his little son Willie on his lap and his son Sophia, his daughter Sophia, and he said, they're going to kill me, but I'm going to be with Jesus Christ. Don't ever compromise before this king or any other. And what was his crime? He was a pastor who was preaching the Word of God, and the king had captured him up in Stirling in his pulpit while he was preaching and took him into the dungeon because he had written the book that defended the National Covenant. So he was the most hated of all of them. And so they went to put him up, and he had been a student of Samuel Rutherford. You all know Samuel Rutherford, who wrote Lex Rex. And Samuel Rutherford was the great dynamic pastor who was his seminary professor at St. Andrews. And so here's James Guthrie, and he gets up on that scaffold, and the sermon is recorded, what he said. Because you were a pastor, you got to preach as long as you want, up to an hour. So he preached this great sermon to these 5,000 people. As he began to preach, they got so angry, they tried to break through the English mob. Many of them were being stabbed by the beef eaters that were standing there with their big swords. But they were saying, "Oh, we're so sorry," because they had turned the Covenanters in. Many of these people had actually become a part of the English conspiracy. And he preached, and he said, "I'm so glad I would never." They offered him a bishopric instead of killing him. He said, "I would give up rather than a bishopric. This is the greatest pulpit that I could ever have in my life. Today is my greatest day." I mean, you can just see this guy gloriously going out for the kingdom. And then he stands there and preaches to the people of Scotland as they're going, "What have we done?" And then he goes to the next level where they're putting the rope around his neck, and he has to stand on this stake on like this cross, and they tie him down. And as they're about ready to put the napkin over his face, he pulls the napkin off his face and he says, the covenants shall yet be Scotland's revival." Neck pulled, they draw and quarter him, send him to all corners of the land. That was in 1661. Most that died after that. He was the first that really started a deluge of deaths over the next 28 years. And in 1688, though, the Scots were free. James was gone, and they were free again to teach and study the Word of God, all because of the faithfulness of men like James Guthrie and Samuel Rutherford and those that had stood for the faith. That is what it takes if you want liberty in a nation. You've got to have men and women willing to give their lives for the truth. And if you have that, nothing can stop it.